My wife said she was pregnant with a naturalness that would have been tender in any other home. She didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for my hand, didn't wait for my reaction. She just dropped it like someone informing that the package arrived or that the coffee ran out. "Honey, I'm pregnant." I stood staring at the edge of the countertop. That clean line that she always kept impeccable, as if the answer were there. I felt something like a pull inside, but it wasn't emotion. It was calculation, dates, days, an invisible calendar that had always accompanied me, and that suddenly started screaming. "Strange," I said. "We haven't been together since your trip." The word trip got stuck in my throat because it had been sounding in my head for weeks like a poorly placed euphemism. She didn't flinch, didn't blush. She didn't look away. She held my gaze with that calm of hers, which wasn't peace, but control. She shrugged, almost imperceptibly, and continued putting away the dishes as if the conversation had already ended. Not an immediate explanation. Not a joke to soften the blow. Not a theatrical anger that would allow me to think she had gotten nervous. Nothing, just that coldness that in recent months had been replacing what I out of habit still called love. I remember the beginning like one remembers old photos with nostalgia that doesn't match the truth. She was efficient, yes, but before that efficiency came with an easy laugh, with a way of looking at me that made me feel chosen. Over the years, that look became evaluative. It wasn't explicit hatred. It wasn't open contempt. It was worse. It was a kind of constant audit, as if I were a project that had started to yield less return. There wasn't a big argument that marked the change. It was a drip, unanswered messages, dinners with the phone on the table, face down like a silent threat, perfumes that weren't hers and that she attributed to the office, round excuses, polished, without cracks, and that habit of making me feel exaggerated when I asked what was fair. "What time are you coming back? Who are you with? Everything okay?" The trip was a turning point, although at the time I didn't know it yet. 3 days with her friends, she said, a getaway to clear her head, to breathe, to come back with energy. She presented it as an act of mental health, almost a responsibility. I nodded as always. I was the man who understood, the reasonable husband, the one who didn't make problems because I believed that love was shown by giving space. The morning she left, she kissed me on the cheek, not on the lips, on the cheek like a relative. She had a small suitcase and a minimal smile. She didn't ask me to take her. She ordered a car. She didn't write to me either. When she arrived, she sent me a generic photo of a coffee with foam, and an everything okay without emotion like an automatic stamp. It's curious how the body finds out before the head. During that weekend, I had a knot in my stomach that didn't loosen with food, nor with beer, nor with the gym. I slept poorly. I woke up at absurd hours and stayed listening to the house, as if the house was also waiting for something. When she returned, she didn't bring stories. She brought tiredness and a strange glow in her eyes, a glow that wasn't shared joy, but private satisfaction. And she also brought distance. She showered as soon as she entered, as if she wanted to wash something off. I said nothing. I swallowed it. What have I done? Many times swallow things to maintain the shape of things, and now she was there telling me she was pregnant. I didn't feel the emotion that's supposed to be felt. I felt vertigo, but not from the idea of a child, from the idea of a lie shaped like a life. I thought about my own naivety, about all the times I defended her character, saying that she was just like that, direct, not very expressive. I repeated to myself like an old mantra, that people don't cheat like that it's not possible, that there are limits. She closed the cabinet gently, looked at me as if I were the slow one in the scene. "Don't start," she murmured, and that was all her concession. It was then that I understood that it wasn't just about a phrase that didn't add up. It was about her not caring that it didn't add up. That truth for her was something negotiable if it suited her. And in that instant, I knew that what was coming wasn't conversation. It was a countdown. That night, when she went to bed without asking if I was okay, I opened a drawer where we kept loose papers, bills, old cards, reminders. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking for a crack, a poorly hidden detail. The first proof that my internal calendar wasn't crazy, and while flipping through pages with my fingers, I realized something that scared me more than the word pregnant for the first time. I didn't want to save us. I wanted to know. Even if knowing broke me, I didn't sleep, not in the real sense. I closed my eyes at times, but my head kept walking around the house like a guard without a shift. I got up before dawn and walked through rooms I knew by heart as if they belonged to someone else. Every object seemed placed to pretend normality. The cushion perfectly centered, the glass upside down in the drainer, her coat hung with the same care with which an alibi is hung. I forced myself to do it like a procedure, without drama, without explosions, without scenes. If I let myself be carried away by the impulse to go into the bedroom and wake her up to demand an explanation, I would lose everything. The little clarity I still had left. She was colder than me, faster, and, above all, had less to lose emotionally. I was still clinging to an idea of us. She, from what I had seen, was already living outside that idea. I started with the simplest, dates. I opened the phone calendar and counted backwards, weeks, days. The trip was there marked with a different color, because she had put it as rest. That word upset me. Rest. From what? From me. From the life we shared. I kept counting. The last time we were together, I didn't remember for passion, but for an absence. It was quick, almost mechanical, and she turned around right away to sleep. There was no hug afterward, no that minimal tenderness that even in tired marriages usually appears as a habit. I counted again. The logic was implacable, and that's why it hurt. It wasn't intuition. It wasn't jealousy. It was arithmetic. I showered and dressed for work. Although I knew I wasn't going to work, putting on a shirt, tying a tie knot, brushing my teeth. All that was a way of pretending that I was still the same person. In the mirror, I saw a pale face, older than I remembered. I realized that I had been training for years to endure small humiliations, and that night had been the final exam. Before leaving, I went back to the drawer of papers. I reviewed it calmly, sheet by sheet. I found pharmacy receipts, warranties, bank letters, nothing, everything clean. She was orderly. She didn't leave friends. She left closed paths. The only strange thing was a hotel bill folded twice, tucked between policies. The hotel name didn't mean anything to me. The date did coincide with the second day of the trip. I felt a wave of heat, as if I had been pushed into an oven. I sat on the kitchen floor with the bill in my hand and waited for my body to stop shaking. I didn't cry. It surprised me not to cry. What I felt was a kind of dry humiliation, without tears, like a burn. I told myself it could be something else, a mistake, a hotel for a meeting, a change of plans, any banal explanation, but I couldn't hold on to it for long. The lie has a specific weight. At first it floats, but when it accumulates it sinks and drags. In the car, instead of going to the site, I went to a cafeteria near the center. I ordered a coffee that I didn't taste. I opened the laptop and entered the share expenses account, the one we use for household payments. I didn't do it with pride. I did it with a feeling of crossing a line that I myself had drawn in my life. I will never be that man who checks. But I realized something uncomfortable. That line was a luxury of those who trust, and I could no longer afford luxuries. I found a payment. Restaurant La Terraza. Another date from the trip. Another blow. It wasn't the kind of place she would go with her friends. It was expensive, discreet, one of those where people touch hands under the table and think no one notices. I also saw gas charge kilometers on the route. She had told me. I saved screenshots. I hated myself for doing it, as if saving them turned me into a sad detective, into a man who documents his own defeat. But I also felt something like relief. Finally, there was a floor, a reality to lean my back against. I returned to the car and stayed inside, looking at the street without seeing it. I thought about how I had gotten there, about my tendency to justify, to soften, to put nice names to things. She's stressed. It's her personality. It'll pass. I repeated those phrases, and they sounded like someone else's excuses, as if someone had written them to deceive me. At midday, she called me. I saw her name on the screen and felt disgust, not for her voice, but for my own automatic reaction from before, that little joy that used to appear when she looked for me. Now the only thing that appeared was a cold tension, a fear of hearing what she was going to say, as if everything were normal. "Are you coming to eat?" she asked. There was no affection in the tone. It was logistics. I didn't answer. I'm busy. Okay, we'll talk later. She hung up without more. Not a question, not an are you okay? Nothing. It was as if my presence was only necessary when it fit her schedule. That afternoon, I didn't return home. I went for a walk in a park and sat on a bench with a phone in my hand, looking at the screenshots over and over as if they were a language I had to learn. I found myself thinking about the man she was with. I didn't imagine him as a rival. I imagined him as a symptom, someone who had been admitted into the space I thought was mine and who now also left a consequence inside my marriage. When the sun started to set, I made a minimal decision, almost ridiculous. I wasn't going to ask her yet. I was going to keep looking. I needed to know how far her contempt went. I needed to see if there was guilt in some corner, some human inconsistency, because a part of me was still looking for a crack to slip hope through. But while driving back and seeing the lights turn on the windows, I understood something that left me empty. I wasn't looking for hope. I was looking for permission to stop loving her. I returned late, enough so that the house had already taken its nighttime pose. Low lights, clean silence. That detergent smell she chose, as if it could also wash the facts. I took off my shoes slowly, not out of respect, but out of an old habit of not altering the order. It surprised me to check that even with my heart turned to stone, I was still trying not to make noise. She was on the sofa with a blanket over her legs, and the television on without volume. On the screen, mouths moved that emitted nothing. It seemed to me a too obvious metaphor for my life. People gesturing, perfect image, and underneath the void. I saw her hand on her belly, more a gesture of ownership than tenderness. She didn't look up when I came in. She just said, as if I were a piece of furniture that had moved out of place, "Where have you been?" I didn't answer right away. I stood in the doorway, watching her. I thought about all the times I looked at her as one looks at something fragile, something to care for. I thought about how easy it is to mistake symbols. I confused her self-control with maturity. I confused her coldness with stability. I confused her silence with peace. Now I saw her as she was, or as she allowed herself to be when she no longer needed to pretend. Taking a turn, I said, "You can't disappear like that." She added. And what caught my attention was that it wasn't "I don't like it." It wasn't "you worry me." It was a verb of permission, as if she administered what I had the right to do. I sat in a kitchen chair, not close to her, separated by the hallway, by the exact distance that is created when one no longer wants to share air. I took out the phone and looked at the screenshots again. I knew that if I showed them without preparation, she would deny. If she denied, I would explode. And I didn't want to explode. I wanted to see her move within the truth, force her to choose. Instead, I stayed silent. The silence stretched. In other times, that silence would have been uncomfortable, a signal to get closer. Now it was a tool. I held it and waited for the tension to betray her. She didn't move. She took a sip of water and continued looking at the mute screen, as if I were background noise. That night I slept on the sofa, not out of dignity, but out of strategy. I wanted to be present without being available. I wanted her to feel, even on a superficial layer, that the world had changed. I lay down with the blanket up to my neck and my body rigid. I didn't dream. Or if I dreamed, I forgot it instantly, like one forgets a noise upon waking. The next morning, she acted as if it were a minor detail. She made coffee, left a cup on the countertop, put on lipstick. Normality wasn't a refuge, it was a challenge. I wondered how many times I had seen her do the same before lying to me. How many times those painted lips had kissed a face that wasn't mine. At work, I pretended to work, answered emails without reading, moved papers. In reality, I was gathering courage for what I didn't want to do, admit that I needed help, that this was no longer a domestic problem, but legal, economic, moral collapse. At midday, I called a lawyer, said my name and heard my voice sounding too controlled, as if emotion were a luxury I couldn't spend. I asked for an appointment. When I hung up, I felt like vomiting, not because of the lawyer, but because of the image of me organizing my own exit, like someone organizing a move. Then, without thinking too much, I bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy far from home, in another area, as if the place could hide me from myself. I kept it in the glove compartment and drove aimlessly for 20 minutes. I realized that it wasn't the test I was looking for. It was physical proof, something I could touch, because lies are gaseous, and I needed something solid. That afternoon, when I entered, she was in the bathroom. I heard the water running. I left the test on the table, in plain sight. I sat down, waited. She came out with her hair wrapped in a towel, saw the box, and for the first time in days her expression changed. It wasn't fear, it was annoyance, as if I had dirted a surface she had just cleaned. "What is this?" she asked. "A test." I answered. "For what?" I kept looking at her. I realized that her question was offensive because of how literal it was. She wasn't pretending ignorance. She was pretending that I had no right to ask. That was her true power, turning my need for truth into a lack of manners. "To know," I said. She laughed, a small laugh, without joy. It gave me more chills than an insult. "You're ridiculous." I didn't answer. I noticed how, instead of getting angry, something inside me turned off with a strange calm. It was as if that word ridiculous acted as a switch. I understood that her contempt wasn't an accident that day. It was a way of seeing life, a way of seeing me. "I'm not going to do it," she sentenced, pushing the box with a finger as if it were trash. "I don't have to prove anything to you." I leaned forward with my forearms on my knees. I felt the weight of a question that was no longer just about a pregnancy. It was about everything, about time, about my role, about whether I was a partner or an accessory. "Then, tell me the truth," I asked, and my voice came out lower than I expected. She finally looked at me as one looks at someone who is about to get in the way. "The truth is that you're tired," she said. "You're paranoid and you're going to ruin everything." That ruin everything made it clear to me that for her, everything wasn't us. Everything was a plan, the image, the life set up like a showcase. I stood up slowly. I didn't make a sudden gesture. I didn't want to give her the scene she perhaps wanted to justify me as the bad one. I took the test box, put it in a bag, and left the kitchen. In the hallway, passing by the mirror, I saw my reflection and understood what I had resisted accepting. I wasn't arguing with a wife. I was negotiating with a person who had already erased me and who now only expected me to collaborate with my own disappearance. The appointment with the lawyer was the next day, in an office that smelled of old paper and capsule coffee. I sat in front of a man who spoke with that professional serenity that turned someone else's disaster into just another case. I told him the essentials without embellishments. The trip, the announced pregnancy, the refusal to take a test, the expenses. When I pronounced the word pregnancy, I noticed that my mouth said it like someone reading a report, not like a future father. The lawyer asked me precise questions: assets, accounts, regime, mortgage. I heard myself answer and felt double. One part of me completed data. Another part stayed behind in the kitchen of my house with the test box pushed like trash. I thought that was the true end of the marriage, not the infidelities, not the arguments. The end was when the other treats you like something to push out of the way. I returned home with a folder under my arm. It was nothing more than paper, but it weighed like a sentence. She was in the living room with the laptop open, talking on the phone in a low voice. When she saw me, she didn't hang up. She just glanced at me sideways, as if I were a new noise to manage. She hung up and gave me a minimal smile, that smile that in court would have served to seem the reasonable person. I realized that she always had a talent, acting without effort, not like a dramatic actress, but like someone who believes life is a procedure. "Where have you been now?" she asked. "To get informed," I said. She raised her eyebrows. "About what?" And there was the absurdity, that she still asked me as if she didn't know, as if reality hadn't sat between us for days. In another time, I would have tried to explain it carefully, seek soft language. That day, not about what happens when a marriage breaks. I answered. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't get upset, just set the laptop aside. She crossed her legs and observed me as one evaluates an employee who is about to complain. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "You're making a theater." That calm contempt pierced me, not for phrase itself, but for the certainty that for her my pain was a whim. I was dramatic when I asked for truth. I was ridiculous when I asked for coherence. I was an obstacle when I asked for a minimum of respect. I sat in front of her at a distance. I took out the phone and placed the screenshots on the table, without pushing them, without throwing them, like someone leaving a found object. "This is from the trip," I said. She looked at the screen for barely a second, just enough to recognize. Then she raised her gaze with an almost irritating calm. "Are you spying on me?" The word spying intended to shift the moral axis. It wasn't "I'm sorry." It wasn't "let's talk." It was attacking the method to avoid the fact. I had seen it in other people, but I never thought I would see it in the woman with whom I shared a life. "I'm looking at what we pay for," I answered. "That's all." She sighed as if I were an uncomfortable task. "I went with someone," she said at last, without emotion, without preparation, and what the rawness left me breathless. Not because she confirmed it, but because she confirmed it as one confirms a reservation, without remorse. I fixed on her face. There was no guilt. There was a kind of bored superiority. Since when I asked, she shrugged. "I don't know, a while." The vagueness was a form of control, not giving me a number, so I couldn't close a wound with a limit. A while, it could be months, it could be years, it could be since I, naive, confused her distance with tiredness. And the pregnancy, I said there for the first time. She hesitated, not out of sensitivity, but because that piece of the plan was more delicate. She put her hand on her belly, not as a maternal gesture, but as one who protects a document. "It's mine," she said, and the phrase sounded ridiculous for its ambition. "It's my life, it's mine." I insisted. She looked at me with disgust. A real disgust, without mask. "I don't know," she spat. "Does that calm you to hear it? Does it make you feel better?" I realized that for her paternity wasn't a bond. It was a tool. If the child was mine, I had to stay. If it wasn't, I had to accept. In both cases, I had to submit to her convenience. I stood up. I noticed that I wasn't shaking. It was strange. I had spent days shaking inside, and yet, in the moment of truth, my body became firm, as if it had finally understood its function, to get me out of there. "I want a test," I said. "No," she answered, and her no was definitive. "I'm not going to let you humiliate me." It wasn't me who was humiliating. It was her, imposing doubt on me as punishment and expecting me to accept it so as not to lose a family image. In that instant, I saw the structure clearly. It wasn't an accident. It was her way of living. She didn't make mistakes. She decided. I went to the bedroom to get a travel bag. I didn't take everything. I took what was necessary not to return that night. T-shirts, pants, the charger. In the closet, I saw our hangers orderly and felt an old rage, but not explosive, a dense rage, mature, like the certainty that I had been used. She followed me to the bedroom door. "If you leave, don't come back," she said. She said it with sadness. She said it like an administrative ultimatum. I looked at her in that instant. Finally, I saw her without the name I had given her for years. She was no longer my wife in the emotional sense. She was a woman capable of lying, betraying, and then demanding obedience. A woman who wanted the advantage of family, without the responsibility of the bond. "I'm not coming back as before," I answered. I left with the bag and went down the stairs without running. When closing the building door, the cold air hit my face and returned something I had lost, the sensation of being my own body. That night, I slept in a cheap hotel. I lay looking at the ceiling and thought about the word victim. It always seemed to me a word too big, too melodramatic. But I understood that it doesn't describe someone weak. It describes someone who has been stolen the right to decide with real information. The next day, I called to request a paternity test, when possible, and to start the separation. I didn't feel triumph. I felt mourning, a strange mourning, because I wasn't crying for her, but for myself, for the man who tried hard to believe, for the man who swallowed signals to sustain a beautiful idea. And in the middle of that mourning appeared a hard calm, the certainty that although it hurt, I preferred the truth to any impeccable house. Because there are things worse than being alone. There are things worse than losing a marriage. The worst is staying where they look at you as if you don't matter. The divorce was quick on the outside and slow on the inside. Quick in papers and appointments, in stamps, slow in the head, where each procedure had the shape of an old defeat. She arrived at the signing with a sober dress and a neutral expression, as if she were closing a bank account. She didn't look me in the eyes more than strictly necessary. There were no apologies or anger, not even that theater she accused me of. Just hurry. The paternity test arrived weeks later. A white envelope with black letters and a clinical language incapable of measuring the damage. I opened in the kitchen of the apartment I rented with the coffee maker making noise, as if life insisted on being normal. I read the conclusion once, then again, as if the words could change order and become merciful. It wasn't mine. I didn't feel immediate relief. I felt a mixture of emptiness and nausea, as if my body had expected another kind of blow, something that hurt in a nobler way. Then, little by little, a cold clarity appeared. I had been a piece in a plan, a useful name to sustain an image while it suited her. And that image collapsed as soon as reality stopped serving her. Yeah,